At 7:45 in the morning on October 12, 2013, a gray Honda Civic pulled up to the south gate of Grand Canyon National Park. The ranger on duty noted nothing unusual. The driver, a 26-year-old geology graduate student named Angela Hafer, handed over her pass with a smile. She looked calm, prepared, happy even, the kind of person who had done this before and knew exactly what she was walking into. The surveillance camera captured her face for 11 seconds before the car moved through the gate and disappeared down the road. Those 11 seconds would become the most studied footage in the entire investigation. Angela was not an amateur. Her backpack contained 4 days of food, topographic maps, a water filtration system, and specialized geological equipment. She had filed a loose itinerary with the university, descend via Tanner Trail, conduct rock surveys near the Colorado River, return by Thursday. She had done solo hikes before. She knew the canyon. By every measure, this was a woman in control of her situation. At 8:15, her phone connected to a cell tower for the last time. She sent one text to her mother. "Connection will be lost in a couple of minutes. I'll be back Thursday before lunch. Love you." The message was calm, routine, the kind of text you send when nothing is wrong. So why, when investigators later pulled the geolocation data, did it show her phone was already a quarter mile off the marked trail? Thursday came and went. No call, no arrival, no Angela. Her parents waited until evening before contacting police, still convincing themselves it was just poor signal in the deep gorges. The missing person report was filed at 7:30 that night. Rangers reached her car at Lapon Point parking lot within the hour. It was exactly where it had been for 4 days, covered in dust, locked, no signs of struggle. On the passenger seat, an unfolded paper map and a receipt from a Tucson outdoor equipment store dated 2 days before the hike. Everything looked like a woman who had planned carefully and simply hadn't come back yet. But search teams spent 5 days combing every inch of Tanner Trail and found nothing. No footprints, no equipment, no trace of a person who had supposedly walked that path in a bright orange windbreaker. The absence itself was a kind of evidence. Not the absence of Angela, but the absence of anything that should have marked her passage. A woman carrying geological equipment, 4 days of food, and topographic maps doesn't leave anything. She leaves weight in the soil, broken stems, the small disturbances that a trained searcher learns to read like a second language. Tanner Trail had none of it, which meant either Angela Hafer had never walked it at all, or something had been very deliberate about making sure she hadn't been seen to. On the 5th day, they found the windbreaker or what was left of it. A torn fragment of orange fabric, snagged on a juniper bush 2 full miles from the official trail, in an area bordering sheer vertical cliffs with no logical reason for any hiker to be there. The edges of the fabric weren't worn or frayed from regular use. They were torn. The question the investigators couldn't answer wasn't where Angela had gone. It was why she had walked directly toward the most dangerous, impassable section of the canyon, and what or who had made her go there. They would spend the next 3 weeks trying to answer that question. Then 2 months. Then the season changed, and the search budget thinned, and the torn orange fabric became one more item in a file that grew heavier while yielding less. The geolocation data still showed her phone a quarter mile off the trail at 8:15 in the morning. The fabric still pointed toward impassable cliffs. The broken edges still suggested force rather than wear. None of it added up to a person. None of it added up to a body, either, which was the detail that kept a small number of investigators awake at night long after the official machinery had moved on. By November 1, 2013, the National Park Service had officially suspended the active search. The statement was careful, measured, and devastating in its simplicity. The chances of finding Angela Hafer alive, it read, were 0. Her name was added to the canyon's long and quiet list of the missing. Her car was towed. Her case file was reclassified. And the Grand Canyon, indifferent as it had always been, continued receiving its 5 million annual visitors without pause. For 5 years, nobody looked for Angela Hafer, because nobody had any reason to believe she was still there. The torn fabric had been examined and re-examined. The geolocation anomaly had been explained, unsatisfyingly, as a calibration error. The leading theory, that she had lost the trail in the early morning light, wandered toward the cliffs and fallen somewhere the search teams couldn't safely follow, was not a comfortable theory, but it was a complete one. Complete enough, at least, to close a file. Complete enough that nobody was thinking about her. In the afternoon, a sandstorm rolled across the Horseshoe Mesa Plateau without warning. On November 14, 2018, 3 amateur cavers, Mark Evans, Sarah Collins, and David Prey, were mapping limestone systems near Horseshoe Mesa Plateau when the weather turned without warning. Winds hit 45 miles per hour. Visibility dropped to a few feet. Sand filled their airways. They needed shelter immediately, and they needed it off the open plateau. Moving along the canyon wall, David Prey spotted a narrow depression almost completely hidden behind dried brush. It wasn't on any of their maps. It wasn't on any map at all. The opening was barely 2 feet wide, just enough to squeeze through sideways. Inside was a dry grotto roughly 10 by 12 feet. Dark, musty. The air carried a smell that one of them later described as sour, like food that had been left out for a very long time. They didn't notice her at first. Sarah Collins saw it before the others. In the far corner, what she initially took for a pile of abandoned rags was moving. Slowly, rhythmically. It was a woman. She was curled in a fetal position, knees pressed to her chin, arms wrapped around her own legs as if she were trying to make herself as small as physically possible. Her skin was the color of earth. Her body was so emaciated that her bones pressed visibly against the surface of her flesh. But the detail that stopped all 3 of them cold, the detail that made Sarah scream, was her hair. It was completely white, not gray, not streaked, pigmentless, tangled, and hanging in dirty ropes down to her lower back. She looked like a woman in her 50s. She was, as investigators would later confirm, 31 years old. When the flashlight beam hit her face directly, she didn't blink, didn't turn away, didn't raise a hand. Her eyes were open but focused on something none of them could see. Somewhere beyond the walls, beyond the people standing in front of her, beyond the present moment entirely. They spoke to her, asked her name, asked if she was hurt, asked if she could hear them. She rocked, back and forth, slowly, and made a sound low in her throat that David Prey would later describe to investigators as the sound of an animal that had forgotten what a voice was. The evacuation took 4 hours. When the medical helicopter landed at Flagstaff Medical Center and the fingerprint scan came back, the officer on duty checked the result twice before calling his superior. The woman with white hair who appeared to be in her 50s matched one name in the database. Angela Hafer, age 31, missing since October 12, 2013. She had been in that canyon for 1,865 days. And not one of the doctors who examined her that night could yet explain what exactly had kept her alive, or what had been done to her to make her look like that. The question of survival came first because it was the one medicine knew how to approach. A human body at 83 pounds. A human foot that had walked 7 days on a fracture that had never been set. Vocal cords that had atrophied from 5 years of disuse. These were things that could be measured, documented, placed into the language of clinical reports. And so the doctors began there because the alternative was to begin somewhere that medicine had no language for at all. The marks on her wrists and ankles waited. The nurses who first noticed them said nothing immediately, the way people sometimes go quiet when they've seen something their mind needs a moment to properly register. The first thing Dr. Elizabeth Wong noted in her medical report was the weight. 83 pounds. On a 5'4" frame, the kind of number that stops a room. Nurses who had worked trauma wards for decades said they had never seen anything like it outside of historical photographs from places no one wanted to remember. The second thing was the silence. Not the silence of a woman who was afraid to speak or hadn't yet found the words. Angela's vocal cords had physically atrophied. 5 years of complete disuse had reduced them to the point where producing sound was no longer something her body knew how to do. The diagnosis was listed clinically in careful medical language, but what it described was simple and horrible. Whatever had happened to Angela in that canyon, she had not spoken a single word in years. The x-rays came back and told their own story. 3 ribs on the left side, fractured and healed without treatment. A complex crack running through her right ankle, fused incorrectly, forming dense bone calluses that had permanently deformed the joint. The bones had knitted themselves back together the only way they could. Slowly, painfully, without splints or medication or anyone to hold them in place. Orthopedic specialists reviewing the scans estimated the injuries had been sustained years earlier, possibly as far back as 2013. Angela had lived with those fractures for the entire duration of her disappearance, walking on a foot that had never been properly set, breathing through ribs that had healed crooked. She had endured all of it without a single painkiller, without a single doctor, without anyone. But it was what the nurses found during the sanitization process that changed the nature of the investigation entirely. On both of Angela's wrists and both of her ankles, encircling the joints like dark bracelets, were ring-shaped scars. The skin in those areas was thickened, discolored, and rough, described in the forensic report as resembling bark more than human tissue. Dr. Richards, the forensic specialist called in to examine them, was unambiguous in his conclusion. These were not friction marks from clothing or equipment. The depth of the scarring, the uniformity of the rings, and the degree of tissue deformation were consistent with one thing only: prolonged mechanical restraint. Metal chain or coarse rope, worn continuously over a period of years, cutting deeper into the skin as the tissue tried and failed to heal around it. Angela Hafer had been shackled. Not for days, not for weeks, for years. The theory of an accident, already weakened by the torn fabric and the inconsistent trail data, collapsed completely at that moment. This was no longer a missing person case or a survival story. It was a crime scene that had been hiding inside a human body for 5 years, waiting for someone to look closely enough to find it. What the investigators still couldn't answer was who had put those chains on her, where exactly she had been held, and whether, in 1,865 days of darkness, she had been the only one. They needed her to tell them. That was the uncomfortable truth at the center of every strategy meeting in those early weeks of the investigation. The physical evidence pointed toward a perpetrator, toward a location, toward something organized and deliberate and still out there. But the evidence stopped at the edges of Angela's body. Whatever she had seen, wherever she had been, whatever face had attached those chains and brought water and chosen her above anyone else, all of it existed only inside a woman who had returned from 5 years underground without a single word, and who showed no signs of being willing to bring any of it back with her. For 3 months after her rescue, Angela Hafer existed in a state that doctors struggled to categorize. She was physically present in room 304 of the Flagstaff Medical Center. She responded to basic stimuli. She ate when food was placed in front of her. But her eyes carried the particular emptiness of someone whose mind had chosen to remain somewhere else entirely, somewhere the doctors couldn't follow and the detectives couldn't reach. Direct questioning was useless. Every attempt to ask about her captivity, about the cave, about who had done this to her, was met with the same response. Nothing. Not resistance. Not fear. Just absence. Dr. Emily Warren, a psychiatrist who specialized in kidnapping trauma, recognized quickly that language was no longer Angela's territory. Her voice was gone, and so, it seemed, was her willingness to re-enter the world through words. So Dr. Warren placed a sketchbook and a set of charcoal pencils on the bedside table one morning and sat down next to Angela without saying anything. She didn't ask. She didn't explain. She simply made the tools available and waited. 2 hours passed in complete silence. Then Angela's hand, covered in small scars, moved slowly toward the black pencil. She gripped it so tightly her knuckles turned white. She held the tip against the paper for a long moment without moving, as if listening for something. And then she began to draw. What emerged over the next hour was not the fragmented, chaotic imagery that trauma specialists typically see from victims in dissociative states. It was precise, technical, rendered with the spatial accuracy of someone trained to read and reproduce geological formations. Angela drew the way she had been taught, not as a patient trying to communicate, but as a scientist documenting a landscape she knew with absolute certainty. The drawing showed a massive flat-topped rock formation, immediately recognizable to the geologists brought in to consult as Votan's throne, a well-known isolated remnant on the north side of the canyon. But the angle was wrong for any tourist or hiker. Angela had drawn it from below, from deep inside the blind zones beneath the Horseshoe Mesa Plateau, from a vantage point no one would have unless they had spent a long time underground looking up. At the base of the formation she drew a dark, irregular opening. Beside it, a human figure with unnaturally long arms hanging below its knees, holding a rifle with a telescopic sight. And next to the figure, an old wagon sitting on rails that led nowhere, its rusted side marked with a clear, deliberate logo, an equilateral triangle. The letters E and L are inscribed inside. The park historian identified the symbol in under 2 hours. It belonged to the Last Chance Mining Company, active in that region from the late 19th century until 1977. Their main tunnel system, the historian confirmed, ran directly beneath the Horseshoe Mesa Plateau. It had been sealed, forgotten, and left off modern maps entirely. When Detective Mark Hall overlaid Angela's drawing onto a topographic map of the canyon, the location she had indicated was more than 4 miles from the cave where the cavers had found her. For miles of unmapped underground terrain, across fractured rock and collapsed tunnels, on a broken ankle that had never properly healed. The cave wasn't where she had been held. It was where she had finally stopped running, which meant she had run from somewhere. And whatever she had run from was still there, sealed behind years of rock and silence, mapped only in the mind of a woman who had communicated it the only way she could, in charcoal lines on paper, with the steady hand of a geologist who trusted what she had observed with her own eyes more than anything anyone else could tell her. The equilateral triangle with the letters E and L. The figure with the long arms and the telescopic rifle. The wagon on rails that led nowhere. She had drawn it carefully, deliberately, the way you draw something you need someone else to find. The raid was authorized within 48 hours of the historian's identification. The teams went in expecting a survivalist shelter. What they found suggested Angela had drawn only what she could see from the outside. The raid on the site Angela had drawn happened within days. What the SWAT team found inside wasn't a primitive survival shelter. It was an engineered underground bunker, fitted with LED lighting, filtered air, stocked shelves of stolen provisions, and a steel door removed from an old mine cage and reinforced with modern bolts. Investigators called it Object Zero. In the far corner of the bunker, on a work table, sat a cardboard shoebox. Inside it, neatly organized and bound with rubber bands, were 12 driver's licenses. 12 names. Tourists from California, Nevada, Utah, Germany. People who had walked into the Grand Canyon over the past decade and never walked out. Next to the box were 3 leather-bound notebooks. The handwriting inside shifted across the pages from careful and deliberate to increasingly fractured and unreadable, tracking what profilers would later describe as a decade-long descent into organized madness. The author referred to his captives as subjects. He wrote about purification, about building a new civilization underground, about breaking personalities down to their base components and rebuilding them according to his own design. Angela appeared in the entries as subject number 4. The others before her were described briefly, clinically, and without remorse. Subject 1's heart had stopped on the 3rd day. Subject 3 had screamed continuously until he was, in the author's words, taken away. But the entries about Angela were different in tone. Longer, be more careful, almost reverent. She is the only one strong enough to listen to the silence and not go crazy, one entry read. Her hair has turned white, but her mind has become clear as crystal. The last entry was dated 1 week before the cavers found her. The ink appeared fresh. The handwriting was large and trembling, pressing hard enough through the paper to leave impressions on the page beneath. She broke the lock. I underestimated her desperation. The iron birds are already flying on the surface. I have to go deeper into the labyrinth where even the devil is afraid to go without a flashlight. Detective Hall read the final line and looked up at the dark opening in the back wall of the bunker. A tunnel entrance, leading down into lower mine horizons that appeared on no official record. Cold air moved through it steadily, rising from somewhere far below. The bunker had answered some questions, but the man who built it was still down there somewhere. And the tunnel in that back wall suggested he had no intention of coming up. For 72 hours, that tunnel was the working assumption, that Briggs had gone deeper, retreating into the lower mine horizons the way he'd retreated from everything for the better part of a decade, disappearing into unmapped geology that gave him every advantage over anyone who tried to follow. The profilers agreed. The search teams prepared for a subterranean pursuit. Nobody expected him to surface at all, let alone on a forest road in broad daylight, in a rusted truck moving toward asphalt like a man who had simply decided the labyrinth wasn't far enough anymore. That miscalculation, that single deviation from a 9-year pattern of careful concealment, was the first one Harlan Briggs had ever made. It would not be the last thing about him that didn't quite fit the profile. On February 13, 2020, Harlan Briggs became the most wanted man in Arizona. The FBI's updated profile, built from the diaries and the bunker's contents, was unambiguous on one point. He would not surrender voluntarily. A man who had spent 9 years engineering an underground fortress, who had erased every trace of his legal existence since 2011, who had written about his work with the calm certainty of someone who believed history would eventually vindicate him. That man did not have surrender anywhere in his psychology. What the profile couldn't predict was how quickly he would surface. Investigators had assumed Briggs would go deeper, further into the canyon's unmapped interior, into the lower mine horizons he had referenced in that final diary entry. Instead, within 72 hours of the bunker raid, thermal imaging drones scanning the Kaibab Plateau detected vehicle movement on Forest Road 22, a remote dirt track that cuts through dense pine forest toward the canyon's northern rim. It was the kind of road that appears on forestry maps but not on anything a casual traveler would consult. The kind of road a person would only know about if they had been studying this landscape for years. Highway Patrol Officer Thomas Reed spotted the vehicle at 2:15 in the afternoon. An old rust-covered dark blue Ford pickup, moving out of the tree line toward the asphalt. No license plates. Rear window blacked out with plastic sheeting. When it registered the flashing lights ahead, it didn't slow down or pull over. Turned around and went back into the forest. The chase that followed lasted 9 miles across snow-packed dirt roads at speeds that should have been impossible for a vehicle that old. Briggs drove with the precision of someone who had mapped every curve of that terrain on foot, using the trees and the drifts to stay just ahead, forcing the patrol cars to brake where he didn't. It ended not with a tactical maneuver but with mechanical failure. The Ford's engine gave out on a curve and went hard into a yellow pine. When the recovery team reached the wreck 3 minutes later, the cab was empty. Boot prints in the snow led east, toward the cliffs. What followed was a 6-hour foot pursuit across the Kaibab Plateau at over 8,000 feet of elevation, in temperatures that dropped to -12°C after sundown. 3 SWAT teams and 2 bloodhound units worked in rotating shifts, losing the trail repeatedly in the wind that poured off the canyon's rim and scattered scent in every direction. Briggs moved through the terrain the way the profilers had warned he would. Not frantically, but deliberately, using rock outcroppings and exposed ridgelines to break his trail, backtracking where the snow was thin enough not to hold prints. He was 52 years old, malnourished by any reasonable standard, and he kept 6 trained pursuit teams occupied for 6 hours in sub-zero conditions. That detail alone said something about the kind of man investigators were dealing with. It was only at 8:10 in the evening, with the temperature still falling and the last light long gone, that the lead team drove him into a dead end. A narrow rocky outcrop projecting over the canyon's edge, with a 3,000-foot drop at his back and armed men closing a semicircle in front of him. Nowhere left to go in any direction that didn't end badly. He was standing at the very edge when the tactical flashlight found him. Not crouching, not preparing to fight, just standing there, leaning slightly back into the void, a .45 caliber revolver hanging loosely in his right hand with the muzzle pointed at the ground. His face, according to Lieutenant Andrews who led the final approach, was weathered to the point of bleeding in the cold. His eyes moved but didn't focus. He looked less like a man being cornered and more like a man who had already gone somewhere else in his mind and left his body standing there out of habit. He didn't raise the weapon. He didn't threaten. When Lieutenant Andrews ordered him to drop it and get down, Briggs stood motionless for a long moment. Then his fingers simply opened. The revolver fell into the snow, but instead of lying down, he began to speak. His voice was quiet, almost conversational, carrying easily in the absolute stillness of the winter forest. He repeated the same words in the same flat tone. not as a defense or an explanation but as a recitation, the way a person repeats something they have said to themselves so many times it has lost all connection to meaning. You don't understand. I didn't kill them. I was hiding them. I was saving them from what was coming. You are all blind. You look at your feet, but you need to look at the stars. It is coming. The arrest was forceful and fast. Briggs didn't resist. He continued murmuring about purification and heavenly fire as they walked him back through the snow toward the evacuation vehicles. Hands cuffed behind him, eyes still fixed on something above the tree line that no one else could see. At the processing stage, investigators examined the army backpack he had been carrying when he fled the truck. The contents were what they expected: survival kit, knife, matches, a hand-drawn star map, a collection of stones worn smooth from handling. The kind of objects a man takes when he believes he is leaving for a long time. But in a zippered side pocket, sealed inside a transparent plastic bag and tied with a pink satin ribbon, was a single lock of hair. Long, soft, completely white. DNA testing the following day confirmed it matched Angela Hafer. The cut was recent. Forensic analysis of the strand structure placed it within days of her rescue. Briggs had been carrying it with him when he ran. Not as evidence, not accidentally. He had packed it deliberately, chosen it over other things he could have taken, tied it with a ribbon and kept it close. It was the detail that said more about him than anything written in the diaries. The diaries had described a man who categorized, who processed it, who used the language of science to contain something that science had no framework for. But the lock of hair and its pink ribbon said something the diaries never quite managed to say directly, that whatever Briggs believed he was building underground, whatever philosophy of purification and new civilization he had committed to the leather-bound pages, there was something underneath all of it that was older and simpler and far less coherent. Something that chose one person above 11 others and tied a ribbon around what it had taken from her and kept it in a zippered pocket close to his body when he ran. The diaries were a man explaining himself to history. The ribbon was something he hadn't meant anyone to see. It was why, when the forensic team found the flat shape beneath the lining of the pack's inner wall and cut the fabric open, everyone in the room went quiet, because it suggested there were other things Briggs hadn't meant anyone to see. The person in that photograph had been officially declared dead 20 years earlier, and nobody in that building could yet explain what their face was doing in the pocket of Harlan Briggs. The trial of Harlan Briggs opened on March 15, 2021, in Flagstaff District Court, and for the first 3 weeks it proceeded the way high-profile criminal trials usually do. Evidence tables covered in bagged exhibits. Expert witnesses reading from forensic reports in careful, measured language. Defense attorneys filing motions that went nowhere. The diaries alone took 4 hours to read into the record, and by the time the state's attorney finished, 3 members of the jury were visibly struggling to maintain the professional distance the courtroom required of them. But none of that was what people remembered afterward. What they remembered was the moment Angela Hafer was wheeled into the courtroom. She came in a wheelchair, flanked by her parents and 2 trauma specialists who had worked with her for over a year. Her white hair was pulled back neatly. She was dressed simply. She looked at nothing in particular as she was positioned facing the bench, and she did not look at Briggs, who sat 30 feet away in an orange prisoner's robe with the same unfocused expression he had worn since the night they arrested him on the cliff. She did not speak. She had not spoken aloud since before the canyon took her. Her vocal cords had recovered enough physically that doctors confirmed speech was theoretically possible. But the silence had long since stopped being a medical condition. It had become something else, a boundary Angela had drawn around herself that no court proceeding, no amount of legal necessity, was going to move. Instead, her attorney read from a written testimony that Angela had compiled over months of therapy sessions with Dr. Warren. Slowly, carefully, every word chosen with the precision of someone who understood that once a thing is said out loud it cannot be unsaid. The courtroom heard about the chains first, about the radius of movement they allowed, which she had eventually memorized so completely that she could navigate it in total darkness without touching the walls, about the way time stopped meaning anything after the first year, and how the calendar she scratched into the cave wall, 1 mark per day, groups of 7, over 1,800 marks in total, was less about tracking time and more about refusing to let it disappear entirely. It was, she wrote, the only way she could prove to herself that she still existed. They heard about the helicopters, about lying in the dark in the early weeks of her captivity, hearing the distant percussion of rotor blades somewhere above the ventilation shafts, close enough that she could feel the vibration in the rock. She screamed until her throat bled. The sound had traveled 6 inches in every direction and stopped. When the helicopters came back a second time, she screamed again. When they didn't come back a third time, she understood, with a finality that she described as oddly quiet, that she was gone from the world's accounting. That somewhere above her, someone had written her name on a list and moved on. It was after that, she wrote, that her hair turned white. Not gradually. Within 3 months of that realization, the pigment was gone entirely. But it was the final section of her testimony that silenced the room in a different way. Because until that moment, many people, investigators included, had assumed that Angela's escape had involved some external factor. A tactical error by Briggs, a structural failure in the mine, perhaps even a moment of conscience. Nobody had quite confronted the full weight of what the evidence actually showed, which was that Angela Hafer had freed herself, alone in the dark with broken bones and no tools, after 5 years of systematic psychological destruction had failed to finish what it started. In early November of 2018, she wrote, Briggs fell ill. A fever, probably pneumonia, that came on quickly and hit hard. He became delirious. His movements, always precise and deliberate in the way that had made him so difficult to anticipate, became slow and uncertain. He brought her water one evening and his hands were shaking badly enough that the cup rattled. He was coughing in long, wrenching spasms that echoed through the tunnels for minutes after he left. When he closed the lock on her chain that night, she heard something she had never heard before in 5 years of listening to that specific sound. It didn't click all the way. The mechanism hadn't seated properly. He was too weak, too distracted by fever, to notice or check. She waited 6 hours. She described lying completely still in the dark, listening to his breathing through the rock, waiting for it to slow and deepen into unconsciousness. When it did, she began, very carefully, to work the shackle. Took 2 hours. When it finally came free, she sat motionless for another 30 minutes. Not because she needed to rest, but because some part of her couldn't immediately process the sensation of her own ankle without metal around it. Then she stood up for the first time in years without the chain telling her where she could go. What followed was 7 days that she described in her testimony with a restraint that was more devastating than any graphic detail could have been. 7 days of moving through unmapped mine tunnels in complete darkness, one hand always on the wall, navigating by the movement of air the way her geology training had taught her to read underground systems. She drank water from puddles on the tunnel floors. She ate lichen scraped from the limestone walls. She moved on a foot that had healed badly enough that every step on uneven ground was its own separate negotiation with pain. On the 7th day she saw light. Not much. A thin gray seam breaking through a collapse of rubble, but enough. She moved the rocks with her hands until the opening was wide enough. She pulled herself through. She found the grotto. She crawled to the corner furthest from the entrance and she stopped moving. 3 days later, a sandstorm drove 3 cavers through a crack in the canyon wall. The verdict came on May 25, 2021. 3 consecutive life sentences, no possibility of parole. Briggs was transferred to Florence Prison's high-security wing, kept in solitary confinement, separated permanently from the underground world he had spent his life building. Whether that constituted justice or just irony depended on who you asked. Most people stopped asking after the verdict. That's the function a trial is meant to serve, to draw a line, to say that on one side of this date the question was open and on the other side it is answered. And in the ways that mattered most to most people, it was answered. Briggs was in Florence. Angela was in Sedona. The case had a docket number and a resolution and 3 consecutive life sentences attached to it. What it didn't have, and what no court ruling was ever going to provide, was an explanation for the photograph, or a recovery of the 12 names in the shoebox, or a definitive answer to the question of who had been parked in the tree line 40 meters behind the checkpoint at 7:45 in the morning on October 12, 2013, watching a gray Honda Civic hand over its pass and drive through. The canyon kept what it took, all except one. The surveillance footage from the south gate still exists. Investigators reviewed it dozens of times during the trial. 11 seconds of a gray Honda Civic, a Ranger, a pass handed over, a smile. But during pretrial discovery, a detail emerged that never made it into the mainstream coverage. In the background of that footage, parked in the tree line roughly 40 meters behind the checkpoint, is a dark-colored pickup truck. It is there when Angela arrives. It is still there when she drives through. The plates are obscured by shadow and the resolution isn't good enough to confirm the make or model with certainty. Nobody ever officially identified that vehicle. The investigators noted it, filed it, moved on. What's harder to move on from is something Angela wrote near the end of her testimony. A detail she included without explanation or elaboration, as if she wasn't sure herself what it meant. She wrote that on the morning she disappeared, before she even reached the trailhead, she had the distinct feeling she was being followed. She had dismissed it. She wrote that she had told herself it was just the canyon, that the canyon always makes you feel watched. Maybe it was,